So today marks exactly 1 year since Jedi Survivor had its global launch, a game which, while very successful, had plenty of controversy and, as always seems to be the case with the Star Wars fanbase, caused a pretty decent divide in the community, being a sequel to one of the most successful Star Wars games of all time in Jedi Fallen Order, which is only outsold by both of EA's Battlefront games and LEGO Star Wars The Complete Saga. This game had so much hype in the lead up, and with that comes a hell of a lot of expectation from the fans, which is only fair in my opinion. The first game was great, so why shouldn't this one be even better? Now, while a lot of people would say the sequel was better, there are an equal amount of players who would say that Survivor had its fair share of shortcomings, and although I absolutely adore this game, I definitely have to agree that it isn't quite perfect. Having finished the game 3 times over now, one of which being up there with the most painstakingly difficult playthroughs I've ever done in my life, where I set the game to Grandmaster and equipped the perks that replaced enemies with tougher variants, as well as being a 1 to 2 hit kill from any enemy in the game, I feel adequately qualified to discuss this game in depth. And so today we're going to be diving deep into both the good and the bad of Jedi Survivor 1 year after launch. The lead up to Jedi Survivor was really strong in a marketing sense, getting its first trailer and name reveal almost 2 years ago now on May 28th, 2022. While this trailer raised plenty of questions, namely who the hell was this grey dude in the Bacta tank, we got our first look at some of the actual gameplay of Survivor at the Game Awards in 2022 with the official reveal trailer, and this is where the hype train for this game really began. From there we got a story trailer as well as the final gameplay trailer, and fans were getting more and more excited as the days went past. Hell, we even got this amazing behind the scenes trailer with Mark Hamill and Cameron Monaghan, which was full of banter and funny moments.
Okay, now use your force powers to pull that sphere.
I really don't need you to explain the Force to me.
But the hype for the game was unfortunately brought to a halt, as only 6 weeks before it was set to launch, EA and Respawn announced they would be delaying the game until April 28th, when it was originally set to launch on March 17th, and this came with many mixed opinions from fans around the world. Surprisingly, most of the reception did seem to be actually on the positive side, because after all of the rushed, buggy messes that have launched over the last few years, people just wanted this game to launch well and be as polished as possible on release. But it did raise more than a few eyebrows and planted the seed of doubt that maybe, just maybe, they were delaying the game because something had gone wrong. And at this point, even the most positive of fans went from excited to cautiously optimistic. Now, the game finally launched on this day last year, and immediately it was hit with a very mixed reception from critics and fans alike. Some people saying it was the best Star Wars game of all time, while others were saying it was one of the biggest flops of 2023 already. While most critic reviews came in super strong, landing the game at a score of 85 on Metacritic, if you take a look at the user score, it points towards a very different story from the actual player base, and this is something that's become more and more common over the years. The critic scores and user scores seem to drift further and further apart. While the game most definitely had some imperfections, most of this was to do with the performance issues that came at launch, the majority of which were on PC, but even the Xbox versions, and in certain cases the PS5 version, had their fair share of performance issues as well, namely an average frame rate that hovered around the 40 to 45 FPS mark, as well as plenty of texture popping issues to go along with that. Now, my own experience of Survivor on launch was actually perfect. I very rarely, if ever, throughout my 100 hours of playtime had any frame drops at all. I genuinely can't name any bugs either, aside from one hilariously annoying bounty hunter bug where the guy I was hunting glitched into a wall and I had to restart from the last checkpoint. But aside from that, the game genuinely ran pretty much flawless for me on the PS5, even before the day 1 patch, as I was lucky enough to be given a review code to play the game before launch, and even that version of the game had no issues either. Unfortunately, just because I had no issues, that doesn't mean everyone else was in the same boat or had the same experience, and the game was definitely hit with a fair amount of criticism and backlash from the player base, and rightly so. We're paying top dollar for games like these, and I think it's only fair we get a smooth, polished experience, considering that is literally what we're paying for. With that being said, over the course of the next 6 to 8 months, Respawn did do a lot of work to fix the game, however, mostly working on the frame rate, the GPU and CPU usage when it comes to the PC, as well as fixing a lot of the texture popping issues. And although the game is still honestly not running in a perfect state 1 year later, it is safe to say it is in a much better state today than it was at launch. One of the key pillars of Jedi Fallen Order's success was its amazing combat, most of which centered around one key element, the most iconic weapon in pop culture history, the lightsaber. Whether you're a fan of Star Wars or you've never even seen it, everyone knows what a lightsaber is and everyone has dreamed of wielding one since they were a kid. Fallen Order gifted us that dream of wielding the lightsaber in such a perfect way, with a fluid, in-depth combat system centered around that weapon, while also tying in the use of another iconic piece of pop culture lore, the Force. With those two elements at our disposal, Fallen Order felt like a true Star Wars fan's dream when it came to the combat, with the only real complaints about it being that there was absolutely zero dismemberment on human enemies, making it sometimes feel like a bit more of a baseball bat than an actual lightsaber. Well, Respawn definitely listened to that feedback, and in Jedi Survivor they took almost everything that we disliked about the combat in the first game, improved it, added to it, and doubled down on the fact that this franchise was going to bring us the best lightsaber gameplay in any Star Wars game to date, with the addition of the stance system bringing 3 completely new weapon stances to the game, as well as refined animations, enemy dismemberment, and for lack of a better word, just a better feeling lightsaber. The combat in Jedi Survivor was such a massive level up from the first game, which felt amazing to say considering how good the combat already was in Fallen Order. While we already had the single blade and the iconic double blade in the first game, we were introduced to the dual blade, the crossguard, and something we'd all speculated about since the first trailer, in the blaster stance, wielding Cal's iconic saber in one hand with our blaster of choice in the other. This added a whole new dynamic to the game that wasn't really there in the first one. It gave us the freedom to make Cal the type of Jedi that we wanted him to be, rather than the type of Jedi that Respawn and Disney wanted him to be, and I can only speak for myself here, but that definitely made me feel far more immersed in the story and just in Cal as a character. The stance system then created endless possibilities for the devs to change things up in our gameplay, with certain stances being really great against one enemy type but not so good against other enemy types, and with players only able to use 2 stances at a time, it really made you think about which stance you liked the best, but also which stances were going to allow you to traverse the more difficult and congested sections of the game, where often you need to change things up to a stance you're maybe not quite as used to in order to deal with a certain set of enemies a little bit easier. Not only did this help with the replayability, but it just generally made the combat feel even more rewarding, and this was on display tenfold when it came to the boss fights in Survivor. Now, while I do think some of the Fallen Order boss fights feel maybe a little bit more iconic and probably a tad more nostalgic too, considering not only is the game older, but I've also finished that game 6 times at this point, I think some of the boss fights we got in Survivor are up there as some of the best boss fights in Star Wars gaming history, and hell, to me they do genuinely go toe to toe with a lot of other games out there. We were introduced to multiple new antagonists, those namely being the High Republic Jedi Dagan Gera, who was essentially frozen in time in a Bacta tank, as well as the formidable, borderline indestructible Gendai known as Ravis, and in my opinion these produced some of the most exciting and also more difficult boss fights in the Jedi franchise so far, both of which had amazing story beats tied to them as well. On top of those two, and keep in mind this is getting into spoiler territory if you haven't played the game yet, so just consider yourself warned, we did see the return of the single most iconic character in Star Wars, the big bad himself, Darth Vader, and this resulted in one of the most intense boss fights the game had to offer, where we had to face this nightmare while playing as Sia, which would unfortunately turn out to be the last confrontation she ever had. The range of boss fights in this game, the locations in which they took place, and the overall passion-filled design of these fights is one of the reasons this game went down as by far my favorite Star Wars game to ever be developed. Now, despite all the praises I sung for Fallen Order earlier on in the video, and don't get me wrong, I absolutely love that game, but man did it have more than its fair share of downfalls along the way. From the lack of fast travel that was so desperately needed in the disorienting maze-like depths of Zepho, to the holographic minimap that required you to be a literal rocket scientist to decipher, and even the lack of customization that saw essentially 2 options for clothing, that being a poncho in a bunch of different colors or no poncho at all, there was definitely a lot lacking about that game despite all the things that it did amazingly well. One of the things I respect so much about Respawn is just how much they listened to the feedback from the first game, seemingly gathering a list of the most requested desired changes or additions from the fanbase and pretty much implementing all of them in the sequel, despite some of those changes being fundamental departures from what they seemingly designed this franchise to be. A lot of us complained that while the level design in the first game was really solid, it'd be great to have more of an open world feeling, and what do you know, know, we got a whole planet in Kobo that was essentially a massive sandbox for players to run around and explore, with so many awesome hidden secrets scattered amongst the main objective areas of the map. With that though came even more of a need for fast travel, something which the first game suffered so poorly from due to the lack of that mechanic, and again, Respawn listened to our feedback despite their own reasoning for not wanting it in the first place. The key area of improvement for me personally, as a big fan of customization and cosmetics in single player games, was the completely fleshed out customization system in Jedi Survivor that the fans had been screaming out for ever since we got our hands on the prequel in 2019. This came with the addition of so many outfits, some of which were pretty basic while others were absolutely amazing, and each came with their own color schemes as well, allowing us even more customization while still bringing back that classic pink poncho for the OGs who didn't want to wear anything else. What made it even better though was the customization of Cal's hair and facial hair, something we'd wanted so badly in the first game, and the only downside to this is that any of you who didn't play your entire playthrough with the mullet and the beard version of Cal have simply never experienced the canon version of the story, because this is canonically what Cal Kestis looks like, and I will simply not be told otherwise. This, combined with the addition of BD1 customization and an even more fleshed out lightsaber customization, had players spending arguably more time fidgeting around with their outfits and weapons than they spent playing the actual game, which to me is always a sign that the game has done something really right when it comes to the customization. The leaps and bounds this game made from Fallen Order, despite having those performance issues at launch, is something that should honestly be studied by other game dev studios out there. The fact they improved so many elements of Fallen Order in only a 3 or so year window is genuinely an amazing feat by the team, something that I do honestly think deserves more recognition than they got. Kobo gave us the first true open world planet that we'd seen so far in the Jedi franchise, and this planet did not disappoint when it came to the overall quality of the level design. From Rambler's Reach, the focal point of the planet where we found Pyloon Saloon run by our old friend Grease Dritus, to open fields patrolled by raiders, to hidden cave systems filled with rancors and all sorts of absurd creatures, even a floating observatory high above the horizon, this planet had just about everything we could want from a more open world type of experience in the Star Wars universe. Throughout the planet, we could also find ancient Jedi training chambers created way back in the High Republic era, hundreds of years before the mainline story of Star Wars took place, where we could challenge ourselves with some amazingly intricate puzzles that, thankfully for a lot of players, were removed from the main path of the game due to complaints about that in Fallen Order, as people often felt overwhelmed by the difficulty and just the sheer amount of puzzles they had to overcome. There were also countless cosmetic items that could be found in chests throughout the planet, some hidden in plain sight while others were in more hard to reach locations, and this gave us plenty of optional side quests to pursue for anyone wanting to experience more than just the main story that Jedi Survivor had to offer. Something else for us to hunt down was the 13 hidden legendary enemies scattered throughout each planet, all of which presented a very difficult boss fight for us to overcome. While some of these were, I guess, more on the easier side, some of them presented some genuine PTSD to anyone who played Jedi Fallen Order, bringing back boss fights that we probably never wanted to experience ever again, but each of which resulted in a very satisfying sequence of adrenaline-filled gameplay. There were also the different force tears spread throughout each planet too, some of which would involve traversal challenges, others would involve absolutely absurd boss fights like taking on 2 rancors at the same time. They thought of pretty much everything when it came to the hidden challenges and the secret side quests that they could have put into this game. One of the best side quests though, which just like the others was completely missable if you didn't explore the world and just stuck to the main story, was the bounty hunter side quests that were available after a certain section of the game. This questline saw you working for Cage Vander, hunting down bounties for her and eventually working your way up the hierarchy of more difficult and hard to find bounties, but eventually Cage turns on you in order to turn you in for an even higher bounty. This resulted in a boss fight with Cage where at the conclusion, to literally everyone's surprise, Boba frickin' Fett shows up wanting to claim the bounty that's actually on Cage's head rather than yours, resulting in a mutual agreement between Cal and Boba, and they go their separate ways. I already knew the amount of passion that had gone into making this game, not only from playing the main story, but also from the discussions I'd had with some of the devs prior to launch, yet this to me was the cherry on top, adding such an awesome questline, completely missable, with such an amazing ending, and somehow avoiding any leaks or spoilers along the way, giving us such a shock and awe moment that wasn't even remotely important to the actual main story of the game. Pretty much all of what I've just mentioned took place just on Kobo though, and we were able to go to even more planets in the game, from new planets like Tanalorr to iconic planets we know and love like Coruscant and Jeddah, both of which were so crucially connected to the main story, giving Star Wars fans some much requested fan service without it being pointless or just thrown in there for the sake of it. While the combat, the exploration, and the general enjoyment of the gameplay is obviously crucial to any game like this, at the end of the day, this was a single-player Star Wars game, and because of that, the story is equally as important as any of that. With Fallen Order leaving the story pretty open-ended, I don't think any of us really knew what to expect from this story, as the possibilities were really endless with how they tied up the previous game, and while endless possibilities can be a great thing when it comes to storytelling, it can equally lead to a story that just doesn't hit the expectations of the fans if it goes in a completely different direction than we'd hoped. Arguably, the most crucial element of storytelling is to do with the characters, and in my opinion, the depth and realism of the characters in this game was a vast improvement on the first game, despite having a really solid story and introduction to many of these characters in Fallen Order. We were introduced to plenty of new characters in the opening hour of the game, many of which went on to die almost immediately in order to set the tone for the rest of the game, that this was a bit of a darker, more gritty story than Fallen Order, or at least the early stages of that game anyway, as we all know what happened at the end was definitely fairly dark to say the least. On top of those new characters though, we were also reintroduced to the original gang from the first game, and even some surprise characters who we assumed were actually dead all this time, all of whom had gone their own way in roughly 5 or so years since Fallen Order had taken place. And even though in terms of our actual playtime it had technically only been hours since we'd last seen these characters, they were able to make it feel like we genuinely hadn't seen the crew for 5 years, like we really were Cal Kestis off fighting the Empire without the original crew that we'd started out with. There were so many moments throughout the game where we had really deep, heartfelt conversations with Grease or Merrin or Seer, and at least for me, I definitely felt a lot more connected to this story than I ever felt in the first game. This might sound like a weird thing to say, but honestly, before Survivor came out, I never really cared that much for Cal Kestis. I didn't dislike him by any means, but I genuinely never felt any connection to him at all, aside from a few of those sadder moments in the story during Order 66 when he was much younger. But I can safely say, after my first playthrough, and even more so after my last 2 playthroughs of this game, Cal Kestis went from being pretty much a nobody type character to me, who I didn't really care for, to probably one of my top 10 or so favorite characters in all of Star Wars. That is how much this story hooked me, and how much emotional depth and character development I feel like they displayed when it came to Cal. He went from a relatively shy young scrapper trying to forget his past and survive the only way he knew how, by suppressing everything he knew and trying to hide in plain sight, to 5 years later a truly brave, confident young Jedi who, even when all of his crew decided to leave, never backed down from the Empire and decided to take them on head to head, despite knowing just how dangerous it would be to reveal to the galaxy that he was in fact a Jedi. From the very beginning of the game, I felt so much more connected to Cal as a character, and therefore more immersed and just interested in the story overall, and to me that made this game stand above Fallen Order, even though I do agree with a lot of the community that overall the path of the story in Fallen Order was potentially a little bit better, having a bit less of that deep lore involved and being more of a simple A to B type of story. The added element of the High Republic lore and background to this game was also an amazing touch. As someone who has been reading the High Republic content ever since it launched, it felt amazing to have that era of Star Wars acknowledged in such a larger platform like a AAA video game. Something else which I think goes unnoticed in a lot of games like this is the amazing cinematography, acting, sound design, and really just the overall production quality of the game that, in my opinion, probably raised this game by a whole point on a typical scale out of 10. When you look at the cinematography, the use of close-ups or wide shots, changing camera angles during pivotal moments, there were times throughout this game where the cutscenes genuinely felt more like a movie than a video game, and despite that sometimes being said in a negative, I mean that in the best way possible. For me, Survivor honestly goes in the same tier of production quality as I'd say for games like God of War Ragnarok or The Last of Us Part 2, where the cutscenes are actually as enjoyable to watch as playing the game itself. If we take a look at another game that came out only just over a year ago now in Hogwarts Legacy, which might I add is also one of my most loved games of all time, you can see a stark difference in the production quality between these two when it comes to most of those cutscenes and story heavy moments. Despite how good Hogwarts Legacy was, one of my main issues with the game was that very raw feeling of the dialogue between you and other characters. It was done in that very typical RPG way of just cutting the camera between you and whoever you're talking to, and while I think that is perfectly fine, it is a stark difference to the way that it was done in Survivor, where you do genuinely feel like you're watching a movie at times, acted by actual humans rather than just watching two NPCs share dialogue back and forth. Now, while I don't think that is crucial for a game to be good, I do appreciate a high production quality like that, and I think for me personally that is why the story hits so well in this game, because I was playing it and having a blast with the gameplay, but then during those cutscenes I was completely hooked throughout the entire story. That being said, I have heard a large amount of people saying that they feel the opposite, in that the story in this game was maybe weaker than the first game, or that they just enjoyed the story of the first game more, and I can definitely understand why. That game did have a really solid storyline and maybe felt just a tad more structured than this one, where at times I was definitely confused by a few story decisions, namely to do with the relatively lackluster use of Dagon Gera, who simultaneously felt like he was the main villain, yet is also one of the more forgettable characters in the entire game in my opinion. Overall, despite many shortcomings in Jedi Survivor, I do personally see it as pretty comfortably the best single player Star Wars game of all time, despite the very tough competition it's going up against with the likes of KOTOR or The Force Unleashed, or hell, even its prequel in Jedi Fallen Order. I think the key thing for this game is that if you removed the Star Wars skin and just set it in a fantasy world with a sword instead of a lightsaber, I do still think it would be a really enjoyable experience. So it's not like it leans too heavily on the Star Wars IP, yet the addition of the IP and the lore around it does fit perfectly with a game of this style. It hit all the right notes for me personally, and while it was far from perfect, especially in the state that it was in at launch combined with the insanity that was the year of 2023 in video games, I do think Respawn delivered an amazing sequel to Fallen Order, and I cannot wait for the sequel to Jedi Survivor, which could potentially leave this trilogy rivaled only by the original trilogy that George Lucas originally created.